So we're broadcasting, but we're not actually waiting for people at this point, correct?
They're trickling in. There's still some more coming in. It takes a couple minutes for, or not a couple minutes, about a minute for everybody who has called in. We're up to about 23 people right now.
Okay.
Aye.
They're still coming in. We're up to 40. Looks like it's kind of leveled down. I think you can go ahead and call it to order, and we may have some stragglers join us still.
Okay, we'll call this meeting, I guess it's a special meeting of the City Schools Decatur Board of Education to order now at 6:37, meeting by Zoom with all the board members present, in addition to most of our committee that we have convened in order to make recommendations regarding the senior tax exemption. So thank you to all who have joined us. And this is a different sort of a meeting where our agenda is going to be devoted entirely to the senior tax exemption. This is the first opportunity that we've had to meet as a group since we received the report. It's not quite true. We received the report from Georgia State University directly in advance of the last meeting, but had not had time to read it. So we've now had time to read and digest the recommendations from GSU, and as well as an update, and that will be the subject of this meeting. And I think the agenda will be for us to first get an explanation of the GSU recommendations, and then have some discussion amongst ourselves, both the committee and the board. But then we'll open it up for discussion so that we can hear from any of the folks who'd like to speak to us. So there'll be a sign up sheet. David, can you explain how to sign up for public comment?
Yeah, in the agenda, there's a link. So if you go to our board site on the website and click on opportunity for public comment on the agenda, there's a form there that you fill out. And that's how we know that you want to speak.
Okay, so if you'll have any problems with that, send a text or something as we're going, and we'll make sure that you get on the list. So that should bring us into the agenda, and we hadn't quite mapped this out. Paula, can you, or are you ready to? And if not, I'm wondering if we could get a brief explanation of the GSU recommendations.
Yes, we're fortunate that Mr. Hans Utz is going to do that for us.
Excellent. Thank you, Hans.
Before we go, Maria Pinkleton is a member of the committee, and she's hanging out as a participant. If we could make her a full member as well. I don't have that ability.
Can you take care of that, Shayna? Okay, she's got it. Thanks.
I'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Judy, please do jump in as we go along. I'm doing this, I'm winging it. I don't have materials presented, so bear with me and please ask questions as we go along. But as everyone knows, we asked Georgia State, some of their researchers, to run some analyses on the scenarios where we offer 2 new exemptions in exchange or in replacement of the existing S4 exemption. And what we wanted to analyze was for individuals aged 65 to 69, a needs-based exemption that was capped around income that cost no more than $1.1 million. We wanted to know what would the requiring income and home value or amount of exemption offered against the home that we could offer in those scenarios. And for individuals that were aged 70 and above, what equivalent home exemption value that would cost no more than $3.2 million. And the reasons why the 1.1 and the 3.2 were selected was because the net cost of in aggregate all exemptions needs to fall into that $4.3 million bucket per the original charter of this committee. Just a quick bit of history for folks that are watching this. Before the S4 exemption, this is the full exemption that we're talking about replacing. Before the S4 exemption came into place, the total cost of exemptions to City Schools of Decatur was on the order of $3.1 million per year. And the charter that we were asked was to identify a way to modify the S4 exemption so that it cost no more than an additional $1.2 million. So the math there is we wanted to figure out how to create an exemption that still offered the maximum amount of benefit to seniors in Decatur while protecting those who have needs-based requirements, but that in aggregate cost no more than the total of $4.3 million. And so this is the analysis that Georgia State has done. And I think I probably should talk a little bit about the history on the first report and then the changes that we asked, and then finally what the numbers are coming out. So the original analysis was done based upon an assumed growth rate of 7% per annum of the digest. That is a typical and reasonable number given the growth that we've seen the last few years. Pandemic notwithstanding, that's hard to anticipate, but it's pretty safe to assume that we're going to see similar growth rates in the overall value of the digest going forward. In addition to the growth of the digest, you have to run an analysis on what you think the growth in the cost of those exemptions are going to be. And so Georgia State offered two scenarios. One was the cost of the exemptions growing the same as the cost of the digest, so 7% per year. That is a conservative estimate. It's rare that the cost of an exemption grows at exactly the same rate as the overall cost of the digest. The other was for a cost of the exemption growing at 4%, which is less conservative, but probably closer to actual practice. And so in these two scenarios, our task is to try to identify which we're more comfortable with and which thus set of recommendations we would go with. The further change that was requested by the board and Dr. Duty communicated to the GSU researchers was a change in the millage rates that we anticipate going forward. So the original analysis assumed a decreasing millage. I think that members of the board quite reasonably felt that given the just unprecedented impact of the COVID pandemic, and the difficulty of anticipating what is going to be happening in terms of impact to the school operations, right? The state has revenue issues, and whether that's going to flow through to what gets distributed to the school system, all these things might change. So the school requested, or the board requested, that we do the analysis based on the fixed 20.25, if I'm correct, the current millage of 20.25 mils.
That's correct.
And so that is, instead of decreasing over time going forward, as in the original analysis, that is now going to be fixed over the period of time that we're modeling. The impact that it has is that it means net, the cost of the exemption is higher because the millage rate is higher, which means proportionately what we're able to offer to keep it within that $4.3 million bucket is slightly less. So with that groundwork, that's a lot to do hand waving on, and I totally understand if not everyone followed that, so please sign up for questions. Happy to answer them. But the net result of that is if we assume that the cost of the exemption is going to grow at the 7% going forward, again, the conservative number, then the home value that we can offer as an exempt amount is $160,000. Let me be very clear what I mean by home value there. I probably shouldn't have used that term. The assessed value that we can offer as exempt is $160,000, which means that if your home value is appraised at $320,000 or less, you would not owe any taxes. That is, your full amount is exempt. That is for both the under 65 and the 70 plus in those home ranges. In the 65 range, we also wanted to exempt based on an income. And I apologize, I've lost my report here in front of me, but I believe the income stayed the same. And in this case, under a $65,000 annual salary in that case. So just to try to summarize this a little bit more concisely, for folks that are age 65 to 69, if you are making $65,000 a year or less, you would be able to exempt up to $160,000 of the appraised value of your home. That is a sizable exemption. If you are age 70 or above, income notwithstanding, you would be able to exempt $160,000 worth of your home. If we choose to instead take the 4% growth rate assumption, the home value would move to $220,000 being exempt. And I am, looking through the report right now as we're looking at it. Somebody keep me honest, but I believe that it was for $55,000 income or less in that case.
So I think two things just to correct real quick. I think on the first one you did, the income cap is actually 90,000, right? That goes with 160,000.
They moved it to 90,000. Okay.
Yep. And then on the second one, it's the $65,000 income with the 220,000 assessed value.
Got it. Okay. So actually that's it. That's an important difference. I apologize. I'm trying to flip back and forth between the two reports, and Zoom is killing me right now because it's making, you could see my head turning back and forth as I'm trying to trace windows. Okay. So then let me restate the impact, right? So if we're assuming a 7% growth, and you make under $90,000 a year, you would exempt $160,000 of the appraised value of your home. If you are 70 and above, regardless of income, you would exempt $160,000 of your home. If we are assuming the 4% growth, if you make less than $65,000 a year, you would exempt up to $220,000 of the appraised value of your home. If you are over 70, it's $220,000 regardless of income. So that's the summary of what has come out of this report. I think it's important to note, it's safe to say these reports need to be rewritten in a way that I think the average human can consume. I know these statistics kind of inside and out, and I find these hard to go through. And so I think there's some clarity that we can probably put into it. There's also a couple of assumptions that we should talk about really clearly that aren't spelled out in the report. Dr. Duty and I very much confirmed this with the researchers, and so it needs to make it into the report. But this is assuming aggregate of all exemptions rolled together. So this is not just the cost of the new exemption. This would be the cost of the total amount exempted, including the new exemption, if we put these assumptions in place. That's important to note because obviously, the way that we found ourselves in this scenario is that some of those assumptions about what people would do with existing exemptions didn't hold through the changes. I think that's probably a good spot for me to stop and let people ask some clarifying questions.
Thank you. Let's just open the floor for questions, but I appreciate the summary. And I also, we should say thanks to you, Hans, but thanks to the whole committee for the time and the effort and the diligence that you've put into coming up with this proposal, which I think is we're in so much better a place to make a good decision this time around because of all your work. So thank you for that. And the Georgia State University study, I do think that we need to do some clarifying. Georgia State's been working fast to get results to us in time for us to use them. So we very much appreciate what they've put into being responsive to our requests. We do need to come in behind, I think, with some additional clarifications and charts and pictures, because it's hard to read. It really is not transparent to just read the material. So we're going to have to come up with some additional materials to present this more clearly to folks. And I guess I'd suggest that for the comment period, that maybe people can focus, one thing to focus on is some of the decision points that you identified, Hans. Number one, is it right to use the conservative growth approach, conservative budgetary approach, which assumes we're going to have a higher millage going forward, or the more aggressive approach, which assumes we're going to be able to lower the millage? I think the board's probably going to be more comfortable with the more conservative approach, because that's just what we need to be, but that would be a subject to comment on. And the other thing would be to listen to those thresholds that we're identifying, and how do those sit with people. For the 65 to 69 exemption, in one case it was a $90,000 adjusted gross income threshold, and in another case, for a different scenario, it was a 65. You might just think, how do those thresholds feel? And likewise, the assessed value thresholds, in one case, it was a $160,000 assessed value, which corresponds to a $320,000 house. Or in the other case, it was a $220,000 assessed value, where that'd be the amount that you take off in the assessed value, which would correspond to a $440,000 house. So just in terms of thinking of how to structure your comments, you might focus on those particular thresholds and decision points.
And just to clarify that last comment, Louis, the house could be worth more than those amounts, but that would be you would have a full tax exemption at those amounts if the house was at that value that you just said.
And Liz, if I could explain the mechanics there really quickly, what that fundamentally means, ignoring the income limits, let's say you're above the income limits. If you have a $500,000 home, you would be able to basically take $440,000 of taxable value off the value of that home. You would only be taxed upon the remaining $80,000 $60,000. I hope if your math guy could do math, right? You would only be taxed on the $60,000 of the value of the home. That's the difference. And so that's the way to think about this. A $160,000 or a $220,000 appraised value limit is actually erasing a pretty substantial amount of the taxable value of the home.
Thanks for that clarification. I tried to think how to do it on the fly, and I thought I'd mess it up. So I'm glad that you did it.
I did mess it up. Right? The math wrong.
So let's just open the floor. I'll just be silent now.
I have an easy one, but I think it's important to kind of give a little bit of background on how we got here. I just wonder if someone from the committee can share why you've decided to suggest 2 exemptions to replace the one that we had previously.
That's a great question. And the core reason, if we go back to the 2 things that we said that we wanted to preserve for seniors in Decatur, the first was we wanted to make sure that we preserved a very high value exemption for all seniors that needed it, right? So for the needs-based individuals, we wanted to preserve a very, very high exemption value. And then we wanted to be able to preserve as much exemption value as possible for all seniors within Decatur. And since we're obviously, there's no way to hide from the fact that we are in fact reducing the exemption, the only way to do that in a way that we felt fair was to effectively push the age of the current exemption from age 65 to age 70. So the individuals that are age 70 now were in the 65-year-old range when the exemptions were first put in place. So if you're used to a really high exemption, we hoped to keep a really high exemption for you going forward. But we still knew that we needed to preserve the meaningful exemption for the needs-based individuals in that 65 to 69-year-old range. And so with some rough analysis that we did on the digest, we identified that 1.1 and the $3.2 million bucket to say 1.1 for needs-based 65 to 69, and then 70 above as absolutely much as we possibly can give to people 70 and above that will still fall into the 3.2, $3.1 million bucket that we had. And so that's where we realized that it really probably was two exemptions. One's a needs-based exemption, and then one is as generous as possible for everybody to hit the age threshold of now 70 instead of 65.
Thank you.
Hans, in your email that you sent out to all of us, October the 14th, one of the points that you made was we've requested a similar analysis on the number of households impacted by these changes. That should come shortly. Do we have any idea how many people we're talking about in the 65 to 69 bucket and how many in the 70 and over?
The short answer right now is unfortunately no. We do know based on the digest how of the 1,300 homesteads in Decatur that are 65 and above, it's half and half-ish. It's maybe 55% that are 70 and above and 45% that are 65 to 69. But in terms of how many fall into that income and home value thresholds that we've identified, we don't know that yet. I mean, Georgia State would have had that for us by this, but we sort of threw them a wrench by telling them to rerun the analysis on the millage. So those numbers are still coming. Certainly, it is our expectation that we will have those estimates as we move forward.
If no one else has a question, I have one. I just wondered if you could walk us through, we did touch on this a little bit already, but if you could just kind of explain how these exemptions stack, assuming they stack as you would age.
Yeah, so the existing S1 to S3 exemptions that are out there all have various functional limitations. And like I want to say in some cases it was, keep me honest here, but like $10,000 a year or less income.
I've got 'em
One
right
was
here,
like
Hans.
50,000. Yep.
If you want, I can take that question if it'd be easier.
Yeah, go ahead.
In front of me. So basically we have the exemptions that apply to the schools. There are 5 different exemptions. So there's the GS1, that's for age 62 with a maximum income of 25,000. And then there's the S1 to S4, which are just the school. And those are various ages, 62, 65, 70, and 80. And so basically what happens is you build up exemptions based on the age that you are, the income amounts that you have, until you get to a maximum of the total value of your property. And so if you are, say, 60, let's say you're 65 years old and you have an income of $18,000, okay? You would then qualify for the GS1, but not the S1. And so you would get an exemption of $50,000 off the assessed value of your house, okay? But if you were age 80, as soon as you hit 80, if you have a maximum income of 40,000, you now get a full exemption. That's already on the books. That's the S2. And so in that case, it wouldn't have to stack. But if you were age 80 and your income was over that amount, so you were over the 40,000, you would not get that full exemption, but you would get the GS1, or no, you would not, I'm sorry, because you wouldn't have the maximum income, but you would get the S3 because you're over 70. And so you would have an exemption amount of 50,000. And so basically they add up for each thing that you qualify for, they add up to the total value of your property.
Okay. So everyone,
value.
regardless of income at age 70, gets a $50,000.
That's correct.
Assessed value deduction, tax exemption. And let's say someone was below, let's say we went with the $90,000 limit.
So I think I see where you're going, Heather. So if we had the let me make sure I'm pulling the right number here. If we had the age 70, let's see, where is it? Or no, hold on.
So if I could just jump into the math there really quickly, the
Yeah, go
scenario, you want to look at a couple different scenarios. One is, do I qualify for both of those exemptions in full? Let's pretend that you do, right? So you would get in this scenario, depending on what we pick today, let's say we're doing the $220,000. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you would get the $220,000 of the exemption that we're talking, plus the $50,000 of the S1, which means you would be able to exempt up to $270,000 of your appraised value of your, your assessed value of your home, which means if the appraised value of your home is $540,000 or less, you would have no taxes. You would have the taxes fully covered.
Okay, thank you. I just think it was important to highlight that because it's important that people understand those other exemptions aren't going away. And that, back to what you said in the very beginning, that we, in this report, have rolled all of those costs in these aggregated amounts.
Well, just to be totally transparent, Heather, I mean, the board could take away the other exemptions and just implement this, but nobody's recommending that. They're recommending leaving these in place, the ones that are existing. Just, I want to make sure the board knows what their options are.
Okay.
You technically could try to move forward and repeal the other exemptions, but I don't think I've heard the committee recommend that. I don't think anyone has recommended repealing those.
Well,
Okay.
let's describe it the way that it would work in the mechanism for the way that it would work, right? I don't think we could repeal, not easily. You could draft this exemption to be either or. You either take this exemption and not take the other exemptions, or you take the other exemptions and only do not take this exemption. You could put that in place. So that is an option. I think it's not a repeal. In that case, you're not repealing it, but you are forcing people to choose, do I want to take existing exemptions or do I want to take this one? I think personally, this is Hans Utz speaking, not necessarily representing the committee, but I would say that probably does not benefit you enough to deal with the complications that raises in terms of managing it and all of the other hassle that would go along with it.
Right. And I think that's a good point to make. I think just making sure people understand at this point, we're not proposing that those other exemptions go away, and we have accounted for their cost in these numbers in this report. So according to this report, we're assuming that they're staying.
Yes. And so to that point, I think Dr. Duty and I probably need to go back to GSU and tell them to make sure that they draw those assumptions explicit. I've read through both of these reports and nowhere in there is it clear that they actually have rolled all those exemptions in.
Correct. I agree, Hans. I remember them verbally assuring us that they had done that, but it's not in writing in the report. So I totally agree.
So in terms of accountability, let's make them put it into the report.
Okay. Thanks. That's clear. Thank you very much.
So the core decision, I think, in front of the committee or the board here tonight is, do we need to take the conservative assumption of 7% growth in the exemptions, which limits us to the $160,000 of appraised value, or assessed value, or are we comfortable with the less conservative 4% growth in the exemptions, and we're comfortable going with a $220,000 assessed value?
Quick question, Hans, or anyone on the committee. So you said moving forward, because we gave GSU a few other numbers to work with, that we don't have how many people this could potentially affect. So when we go back to them, is there a way to say, if we go the 4% route, this is essentially who we could affect and how many people, versus the 7%? Is there a way for them to break that down for us as well? And if they can, how long do you think that would take?
So yes, that's absolutely the ask in front of them. They're working on that now. They'll get those numbers back to us. it's a substantially larger number of people impacted under the 220,000 versus the 160,000, right? Like it's just the larger the value, the better it is. Now, having said that, let me claw that back a little bit. The income limits matter in those scenarios, right? So there are more people that make less than 90,000 than there are people that make less than 65,000. So we're actually, what we're saying is we would take a much larger appraised value, meaning that the impact of that exemption is much larger. You're saving people a bunch more money at the expense of, in the 65 to 69 age range, you're limiting it to a smaller subset of people, right? So like the core question, I guess the answer is, is a $65,000 a year income level enough of a determination of what constitutes needs-based? Or do you want to go all the way up to 90,000 and offer a smaller exempted amount?
I think that's really important to emphasize the two things. One, we do have a feel for the number of homes at the 70 plus. It's the 65 to 69 that we don't have a good feel for at this point of how many. And the other one is what Hans was just saying, that you got to realize they're looking at two different variables here, and there may be other combinations of those variables that also meet the goal. And so they provided us with what they thought was the best of the income limitation and an associated home exemption amount. But there are other pairings of income and exemption amount that could potentially come close to that goal as well. And so if the desire is to set it, like for instance, if you read this report and you say, I thought we were looking at needs-based and $90,000 and over doesn't feel needs-based for 65 to 69, then you need to let us know what does feel need-based, because we can go back to them and say, here's what we actually need. We can't have the income exceed X dollars, because at that point we don't feel like it's need-based. So now tell us the home value that could be associated with a maximum number there. Would you agree, Hans, that that's one of the variables we could tweak on with those two combinations?
Yes, though I think it's safe to say that the income limit is going to be less impacting than the growth rate that we presume, right? The growth rate is much
Quite
more
possibly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this is a little statistically dorky for those of you that are interested in it, but part of what we ask for is the standard deviations associated with this, and the bands around values are extraordinarily tight. You usually don't see that in large population studies, but that's partially because we actually aren't dealing with a really large population here. This is a pretty small subset of individuals and people. So the ability to move it, you have to make fairly big changes to see substantive changes in moving it. I guess a good way to frame it would be, what income level does the board feel constitute? And let me ask for the commission too, because we've done affordable housing. What income level feels correct for needs-based?
So the 65K is very much in line with 100% AMI for a two-person household. So I think that helps a little bit with setting that kind of, where do the people land in this?
So we're basically saying 65K is the average income of the area. 90K is capturing a substantially higher portion of just the average. And that, I mean, to me, that sounds like 65 or even less than 65 is probably closer to what we need by needs-based. And that would mean if we go, so let me just make this explicit. If we go less than 65, if we said the number is 55, then fundamentally that would mean we could pick a higher exempted value of the home.
I mean, I'm not sure how the rest of the board feels, but when I see 90,000, I don't think needs-based. And Paula, you gave kind of a good explanation where 65 is an average. So I don't know if I would see 65 as a needs-based either. And many of the seniors that we've all kind of spoken with or are in touch with, don't bring in anywhere near that amount. So I definitely think that's a good starting point for us to figure out what we think that number is. And I'm definitely curious to hear what others are thinking. I mean, 55 felt a little better, 45. When I'm thinking about needs and really trying to assess who's struggling to stay in Decatur based on what they're bringing in. And I don't think anyone at 65 or 90,000 is necessarily struggling. And that taxes would necessarily keep them if they decide to leave or not leave. It might be for other reasons. So I'm just, kind of thinking off the top of my head, I'm not stuck to it or anything, but 45 to 50 feels more in the needs-based area for me. And so I am curious to hear what the committee and the board is thinking as far as income is concerned.
I agree.
You're not coming through, Jana. So let me clarify. So we've got, for the proposal on the table, or the range of proposals on the table, would have for 70 and over a capped exemption, but it would not be income limited. And so
That's
the
correct.
income limits apply only to the needs-based exemption, the needs-based part, which is 65 to 69. And then
That's
the question is, what's an appropriate threshold to consider that, to qualify for a needs-based exemption?
And I think the other thing to point out is the desire for there not to be a strange result of turning 70.
Mhm.
And that the idea is that when you turn 70, if you already qualified for that exemption 65 to 69, you'd have at least that amount when you turn 70, and that you wouldn't, because when that income exemption goes away, we didn't want people to suddenly be shocked by, or the
Right.
committee didn't want people to be suddenly shocked by a tax bill that was different just because they turned 70.
Right. So like,
The mechanism there, sorry, Heather, the mechanism there is why the home values exempted are the same in the 65 to 69 and the 70 above, right? As long as the exempted home value stays the same, then there's no change as you age into that 70 bracket.
right. So the unintended consequence of saying that we're lowering the limit of the income and raising then the exempted home value amount is that carries over into the 70 plus exemption, which then could cost us a whole lot more, because there's no income limit, and we're saying we want to keep that home assessed value exemption the same. So if we, for example, lowered it to 50,000 so that we could raise the assessed value exemption to, I'm just going to guess, to 250, then that would mean that when people turn 70 and the income limit goes away, we would continue to give everybody the exemption of 250 assessed value forever. And
Complicated.
that's could be a lot. I mean, I'm looking at table 3, and I did a quick calculation because, when you look at the exempt value of $160,000 of assessed value exempted versus the 220,000 assessed value exempted, when you get to 2025, it's very close. So both of those kind of fit our initial criteria of not going above 3.2 5 years out. However, when you add up the difference in the tax reduction year over year, it actually adds up to $1.3 million more cost to the school system over those 5 years for a home assessed value of $220,000 versus the $160,000. So if you kind of see where I'm going with that, like for 2020, the difference is 0.36 million. For 2021, the difference between the 2.43 and the 2.75 is 0.32 million. So you go down the line, and if you add all that up, it ends up costing a lot, even though it levels out.
So it's a couple things to point out with that, right? You're not wrong, but these are not net present value figures either, right? So if you adjust for net present value, that difference is going to shrink a little bit. The other thing is, but you talk about it costing more, but we have set the standard that we aren't going to be more than 4.3 by 2025. What you're
Correct.
saying in the 160K number is you're substantially below 4.3 for like 4 years. So it's you're actually getting more money. It's not that it's, I would not look at through the lens of saying the 220 is costing you more money to get to 2025. It's still saving you money relative to how much you want to cost before you get to 2025. You're just actually saving even more in the 160 scenario. And so in both scenarios, the numbers are much lower than what we put as the threshold until we hit the year 2025.
Yeah, that's correct. And the difference is about 1.3 million.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my point was just that playing with the income, assuming that if we lower that limit and we assume that then the home value assessed exemption goes up, we have to also account for how that's going to carry forward for the no income limit 70 plus group.
And we can't answer that now, but it's a really important question for us to get an answer to before we do anything.
It is. It's also what would be called a dual variable optimization, right? Like there's no reason why we have to leave it at 1.1 million for the 65 to 69 and leave it at the 3.2 for the 70 and above. If we say we're going to reduce it to 45K of income and the resulting home value of say $250,000 means that it only costs us $900,000 a year, we can move that hunk of money into the 70 above and give them the higher home value as well. Now that math gets quite complicated. I mean, you're talking about several different optimization curves, but we can start to shift the numbers around that way. What I want to set expectations around though is that the cost of the 65 to 69 is proportionately lower than the cost of the 70 and above. And the impact of reducing income on the 65 to 69 is going to have proportionately smaller than anticipated impact on the value of the home, right? So going from say 65,000 to 45,000 does not necessarily mean you get to move from a 220,000 to a 250,000 home. It may be that you move from a $220,000 to a $228,000 home, right? So you're not getting a one-to-one bang for your buck on swapping those numbers around, right? And so I think that we should pick the number that feels correct around what constitutes needs-based. And then, go ahead, Louis, sorry.
No, I thought you were done.
But I think I am starting to wind
Okay.
up.
I was just going to say, in terms of the meeting, I would suggest that if others have comments, let's make them, but we might turn to the public comment maybe by 7:30 to make sure that we're there and we can hear from folks in a reasonable period of time. And
I just
before
want
we
to
do, I
throw
know
in that S2 kicks in at 80 for 40,000 for need already. So the gap is there. That should be pointed out. So that's already accounted for. In theory, Hans and David pointed out, we need to make sure they're there. So if we set it for 45, it's a 10-year gap figuring out. And then the Affordable Housing Task Force, Maria, I think you put it down on the numbers that I read, came back with 79.7. I don't know where they came with that number, but that was the Decatur AMI for the
That's
things. It's
that's for a 4-person household.
for a four person is 70, and that's for the entire. That's not
Atlanta
age
metro area.
controlled. That's the Atlanta metro.
Metro,
Yeah,
yep.
it's actually higher in the city of Decatur.
Okay. Do we know where that is? Did the task force ever produce that for the city of Decatur, or is that impossible to get?
I can see if I can put my hand on it real quick.
You speaking income?
Yeah.
92.9.
92.9.
Yep,
Okay.
that's what I remember.
Okay. Thank you.
Again, that's for a 4-person household. I want to be clear about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dan has just informed me that we don't have any people who signed up for comment, so that doesn't seem to be an issue.
I mean,
The
I know
sorry,
the
Heather, go
committee had a lot of really robust conversations over the summer, several meetings where you guys talked about who we wanted to impact and why and how we could do that best. So I'm really curious if the committee has some suggestions to share on what you would recommend as the income cap.
$90 is high, right? I mean, that's a large number for a presuming two-person household. I also want to weigh in on the growth rate number because we're kind of talking around that, but it's important because that number, growth rates are those kinds of things that have really disproportionate outsized impacts several years out. I am actually comfortable with the 4% number and not the 7% number. It is, in fact, the case that exemptions grow more slowly than the rate of the digest. And that's in part because home values grow above the thresholds that we set. So people start paying proportionately more in out years on taxes. Incomes also grow differently than that. And so what you see with exemptions is that if you set it now, a certain number of homes are going to fall under that exemption threshold. In out years, relatively fewer of those homes will fall under those exemption households. And so basically, as the digest grows, a proportionately smaller number of individuals are paying or are being able to be fully exempt on their home value in those out years. And so in looking at the way that the cost of the exemptions had grown, 4% is within the window of what is reasonable.
So
All of this is issued with the caveat of saying it's completely and utterly impossible to predict what's going to happen with the pandemic. Like it could throw a wrench into all of that. But it's not an unreasonable assumption to say that the cost of the exemption will grow lower than the cost of the actual growth of the digest itself. Go ahead, Louis. Sorry, you're going to ask a question.
You just, I was going to ask you to put a point on the point you just put a point on. Which they confirmed it.
Okay. I mean, what that fundamentally means is I think we have a little bit more room. It means we're probably closer to the 220 than we are the 160, that's good news. And if we can come up with a comfortable number, what I will say is that if we go from 60, so the 220 number is tied to a $65,000 salary. If we take that $65,000 salary and move it instead to, let's just say $45,000, the analysis has to be run. So don't hold me to this, but the likely impact on home value is going to be lower than you're imagining. It's not going to be 250 or 270. It'll be more like 230. Which is not nothing, right? So, I mean, I absolutely think that we should run the analysis and see where that takes us, but I don't think we're going to get, $50,000 more of home value that we can exempt based on that.
So Jana, let's just see if Jana's got her mic fixed.
I'm here. Hear me?
Yeah.
So no, I was gonna agree with Tasha that as she said, and Hans just mentioned, 90,000 seemed like a lot. And I was gonna say Paula's statement really helped to put things in context for me in terms of the average household income for two people here. So I would want to consider, look at going lower. But I appreciate Heather asking the question of what the committee's recommendation would be in terms of income level.
I've tried to think of this as how to present it to the DeKalb delegation, how to present it to the city commission in something that is a number that's easily understood, which is why I personally think 100% AMI makes a lot of sense. Either that or shoot for 80% of AMI, but that at that point, that's probably an even better translation back to the city based on when we talk about affordable housing being at 80% of AMI. I would suggest, however, that we do find the numbers for Decatur as opposed to the Atlanta metro area, because Decatur is substantially higher.
Was the
And I'm
65 a
still
Decatur
looking for
number?
it now.
Was
I'm
the
sorry?
65, sorry, Paula, was the 65, I thought the 65 was the Decatur AMI. That's
No,
the
that's
region?
That's Atlanta metro.
That's Metro Atlanta.
it.
Yeah.
I'm still looking for the other one.
So we do definitely need to know 2 Homestead AMI or 2 individual.
It's not controlled for age, but Phil hit it on the dot. The task force, as reported by Bill Banks, and the reporting is 92, 360.
For 4 though, right?
Right.
For 4. 95, 640. I'm sorry. I was reading in a different spot.
It's AMI for
AMI.
Decatur?
For the city of Decatur.
Okay.
And to be eligible for workforce housing, according to them, they went for a 60% AMI or 47,820 in the proposal that they put forth.
But again, that's still a family of 4, right?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. And there's no data for family of 2 in the quick searches that I did.
I have a comment on the,
Louis, can I interrupt just for a second?
please.
I am worried that maybe there aren't people signed up just because it's complicated to get signed up. And I noticed that we do have the function where people can raise their hands. And so might I suggest an alternative be that we let people raise their hand and then Shayna can go through and call on them and unmute them. And that way we can get the public comment still.
Perfect. And if we get some raised hands, let's turn to that as soon as we can.
Yeah, so I think I see 2 with hands raised. So Shayna, if you just want to kind of go through and announce people and pick somebody who has a hand up and unmute them so they can talk. That way we can go ahead and get some public comment a little easier than going through the other systems.
Okay. So I'm gonna unmute David Draper. David, are you there?
I just got an invitation to unmute, but I'm not David Draper.
Okay, Michelle Wrighton,
Yes.
you can go ahead and speak.
I have a question. The comments have been very enlightening to me. I'm just to understand some of the details. And I understand the questions about AMI, but I have another question, which is this. That's a statistical average, and I think it has value, but my question is, what is an acceptable percentage of annual income for property tax? For example, if my property taxes with only the homestead exemption, no senior exemption, are $6,500 a year, and my income is $60,000, just for hypothetical. So that's over 10% of my annual income. Is that a factor that the committee takes into consideration? Like what percentage of household income should go to property tax?
A good question. Does anyone have an answer to it?
So the direct answer is no. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to run that analysis on each separate property. The intention of providing the combination of income income level and exempted value of home is meant to solve the exact problem that you're describing, right? And so part of the reason why the exemptions that were in place previous to this new senior homestead exemption, part of the reason why they were, large numbers of people didn't take them is because they were enacted in 1985 or something, and they were based on income levels and home values in 1985, which aren't relevant today. And so the objective of trying to ensure that within a certain income level, and then for 70 and above, regardless of income level, a substantial portion of the value of the home is exempt, is to change the exact equation that you're describing. So 10%, if a $6,500 home, I'm not going to be able to reverse engineer a 2.25 millage on that. But I mean, saying that, let's say that it's a $600,000 home, you would have, under the 220 rubric the $220,000 rubric that we're talking about, $440,000 of the value of that home would be exempt. And so you would only be paying taxes on, the difference in that particular value, the 160K remaining. And so it should, in that scenario, be dramatically below, substantially below the 10% threshold that you're describing.
Okay, well, I think I understand that it's a different way to approach it, but what sounds like you're saying is it would achieve the same result. I guess my point is that talking about AMI doesn't necessarily reveal the realities of a household's expenses. So that I appreciate your addressing that.
And it's a fair point. And as much as we might like to be able to do that, the problem is it's not just AMI, or it's not just the specific income that you're describing, it's also the home value of the house that you're in. And so if we were to say it's only going to be a certain percentage, we can end up in a scenario where somebody with a proportionately lower income is still stuck paying a substantially higher percent of their income on the home versus somebody that has a much higher income. And we're trying to fix that by looking not just at that ratio, but by also accounting for home value, the home value exemption, and the income level.
Thank you very much. That's a very helpful explanation.
I have at least one other hand.
Thank you. Now we will have David Draper.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, great. My question is similar a little bit on the AMI, but it's not the same question. The AMI, if I understand that correctly, is based on average income of everyone within the city limits. So it includes renters, it includes, I assume, people in other people's homes, like adult children and stuff like that. I am not thinking that lowering it substantially, the threshold, is going to make a whole lot of difference for dual income individuals who own their home and are actually paying property taxes. Because I don't know that, and of course, some of you said you've talked to some of your friends, and I don't know whether those are all homeowners. That it is a factor that the AMI is talking about people that are working. It's not talking about homeowners. So I'm not sure that the impact of that will be as great as by lowering it as you think it might be for allowing people to have a higher assessment, was one of my observations.
If you don't mind me asking, Mr. Draper, let me make
Yeah.
sure that I understand your question or your comment. You're saying that by lowering the income threshold, say from 65 to 45, you don't believe that it's actually going to allow us to exempt that much more home value for people. And so you want us to be cautious about lowering it too much. Are we understanding that correctly?
I'm not really recommending you be cautious about it. I just don't think that when you're talking about home ownership, that you're going to capture a whole lot of added, I mean, that you're going to capture people. You're right. I'm not exactly advocating either way. I'm just thinking there's a factor there with it, that the AMI is not the only thing to look at. And it's not that I wouldn't worry that much about the AMI is what I'm trying to say. That I think that if you're a little higher, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference in the homeowner universe that we're talking about versus the AMI universe, which is working people and probably based on IRS and maybe state income tax, information.
It's a fair point, and I think maybe I wasn't as clear when I said that, but the point that I was making is if we reduce AMI, a proportionate reduction in AMI is not going to have a proportionate increase in home value that can be exempted. So I do actually think erring on the side of a slightly higher AMI is going to be more impactful than the rather small amount of incremental exemption that can be done. And so I do think if I'm not mistaken, that's a little bit similar to what you're saying.
What you just said, I would agree 100% with.
Okay.
We're err at a point where we're not missing some people who are homeowners.
Yep.
Just for an AMI figure that really is not linked to home ownership as a statistic that we get from the state or the federal figures. So, I mean, I would like to see as many people, especially in the lower income levels, and I would consider 65,000 not a huge income level. And it would be great if we could do it and include some additional families in that amount of money in the home ownership universe. I don't have a dog in this fight, okay? I'm going to be 70 in a couple months, so whatever way you guys are going, I'm going to get some exemption, and that's okay. So and if I didn't get it, I could live, but I want to make sure that we do going on, regardless of the numbers we're dealing with, capture some people who might otherwise have to sell their homes, because it's true that couples die, okay? And all of a sudden, the two couple family making 65,000 is a one couple family, maybe a widow making 23,000 or something. And maybe the next year she might be available under a lower level, but it's a lot of hoops to run through if we have a higher figure just to keep the universe, and she doesn't have to worry about anything. It's just kind of, that's what I think about, or the people I've seen that have been left with homes that they can't afford to repair and they have to sell. And that's the sort of person we want to make sure we don't leave behind.
I would like to add to your question, Mr. Draper, to your point that when we initially began discussing AMI as a part of what we were looking at, we knew that this demographic was probably not hitting those numbers.
Yeah.
And so, what AMI is, like you said, there's the working group, and then there's this population of a lot of retired homeowners that are not hitting what these numbers that even in Decatur are small. I mean, when you say $276,000, I think that was a house number, a value. What does $276,000 get you in Decatur? You really had to step back and think about being really, really flexible and not taking that AMI number as being a definitive true figure for this population that is most eminently affected.
Yeah, that's why the 4% and 7% percentages are so important right now in your discussion decision, I think. Yeah. Thank you for taking my question. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Draper.
Next, we have Terry. Terry,
Okay, you got me?
Got you
It's
now.
asking Richard, okay? I'll give you a real world scenario. I've lived in Decatur for 23 years. I just turned 65. I'm going to be going on Social Security. I just got a 62% increase on my property taxes. I'm going to be paying $600 a month just in property taxes. I'm having to think about leaving Decatur because that's 25% of my Social Security. Here.
And so if you don't mind me ask a couple clarifying questions,
Sure.
Terry, because I think it's important to talk about these scenarios in detail. The numbers that you're suggesting means that in any of our income scenarios, you would meet that exemption criteria. So you would be getting the exemption for 65 to 69, and then that would carry to 70 and above. If you don't mind me asking, sir, the value of the home that is generating those taxes, can you share the appraised value or give us a sense of range so we can be more explicit?
Let him finish. Okay.
It went from 246,000 to 409.
And that's the underlying value of the home, or is that the taxable value of the home? I'm sorry for that. This is a really tough question and it's complicated and I understand, but is that the full appraised value of the county or is that the value that you're taxed against?
Okay, I have a total value and a 50% value.
The 50% value, please, sir.
It went from 123 to 204.
So under the proposals that we're laying out here today, in any scenario, so none of the proposals would change this for you. In any scenario, the full value of your home would be exempt for your school taxes. Now, that doesn't change anything for the city. That doesn't change anything for the county, but you would not be impacted by the school taxes. You would still have the full effect of the existing tax rubric that the schools have in place, which is a full exemption.
That's great. Yes. Yeah. Because of the $7,000, 4,000 is for the school.
Are you in the city of Decatur right now?
Yeah, and we have no children.
So you should be full. The S4 exempt. Please register for the S4 exemption if you have not already.
Well,
I
called because of COVID. I called, and they said that you missed the deadline, but you can do it for January. But
okay.
if we don't keep this, and I have to pay $7,000 a year in property taxes, I would really have to think about moving. I mean, it's $600 a month just in property taxes.
The good news, Mr. Terry, is that the way that we're trying to structure the 65 to 69 is meant to help specifically individuals like yourself. So we are attempting to account for both the value of the home and for the income that you have and make sure that you're protected.
And now say thank you very much.
Great. And we are really appreciative of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for
and I like your coaching back there. She's doing a great job.
And we have no other raised hands at the moment.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
The question was raised earlier about who is this population that we're trying to reach in terms of need? And it just made me think of, for any of us who have been involved with the King Day Service Project, that is such a rewarding time to be of service. And if you volunteer, you get to go into homes of a lot of our neighbors, and you can kind of see what their need base is. And some of them are really having quite a time of managing with maintenance, and that's why the King effort is such an important way of building community, getting to know your neighbors, and also doing a great service. So it just occurred to me that in terms of putting kind of a face around it and a sort of a need of a segment of our neighbors, for me, that's part of the target population.
Thank you. I agree too. I think that that's one of the most rewarding volunteer activities is the King Day, and that's a eye-opening, but you also just making a contribution. I'd encourage everybody to go out and chip in because it's just a wonderful weekend.
We have another person wanting to speak. Sandra.
Hello.
Okay.
I'm so glad that I joined this meeting. I wanted to get some clarification because I 3 weeks ago moved back to Decatur. And one of my reasons for moving back was because of the benefits offered through the discounted real estate taxes. That was only one of my reasons, of course, but so thank you very much for clarifying this issue, and I wish you a lot of success in coming up with a good plan.
Thank you, Sandra. We really appreciate that.
We have no other raised hands.
I'm trying to think, maybe we can have a brief discussion and maybe call the meeting by 8. But in terms of next steps, we need a fleshed out concrete proposal. And we need to make a decision about the assumption that we make and the growth in the, not the growth in the tax digest, but what's going to be the growth in the cost of the exemption. And so we're going to have to make these decisions, and we're going to have to take a vote on it. And I suppose it's going to have to come at the next meeting. We can have another opportunity for people to comment, but I think we owe it to everybody to have a good fleshed out specific proposal to comment on prior to that meeting with some cleaned up materials that are clarify some of the points that we've talked about today. Anybody have a good suggestion for how we get that done between now and when is our meeting? Is it November, something like November 13 or something like that? I just made that up, but it's going to be the second week in November. So that's about how much time we've got.
So if I may,
please.
I think we're closer on the math than we may realize. So I'm just going to ask 2 real questions for the board. Are you comfortable with the 4%, or do you want to look at the 7? Because if you're comfortable with the 4%, then we have kind of a range of values that we can begin evaluating. Are you comfortable with the less conservative assumption about the growth in the cost of the exemption?
I am not. I wish I could say that I am, but just there's so much uncertainty right now that I'm not comfortable. I feel like as a school system, and to really prioritize our students and our learning and make sure we have the resources we need, I don't think we can afford not to be conservative just because of the given situation. And that's not to do with just our local economy. It has to do with the economy of the state. And because of COVID, we've lost, we really don't know what our budget's going to look like next year. And we don't know how much our state cuts are going to be. Please someone jump in, but I think we were handed a last minute state cut of over $5 million earlier this year, that we had to pull $5 million out of our, what do you call it?
Reserve.
Reserve, thank you.
Yep.
And so that's a big, big deal. And so, so we have less reserve than we planned by $5 million. We don't know what next year is going to look like. And I anticipate we're going to be handed some steep cuts, not to mention that our SPLOST money is less because people are not eating out at restaurants. All around, I feel like I feel like we need to be conservative at this juncture just because we have so many unknowns. But it still looks like, even if we did assume the high growth assumption, it still looks like we can make some significant contributions to this tax exemption. And so I personally prefer to look at those for those reasons.
I'll second.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Louis.
I was just going to say, I'll second that. I can tell you that I'm not comfortable taking anything but the conservative. That doesn't mean that I couldn't be persuaded otherwise, but you asked if I'm comfortable. I'm not. And so that would require a lot more thought. There's also, though, a second issue, which, I mean, we do have to remember that the senior exemption is very important to us, and we're trying to achieve some specific goals in terms of keeping seniors in Decatur and making sure that taxes aren't the reason that people move out, and trying to maintain some of the income and age and racial diversity that we're losing in our city. There are other demands on our resources as well. And you know, Heather pointed out that that we've lost a fair bit of our reserve as a result of the budget predicament that we're in. A lot of that was what we were going to use to expand the Early Childhood Learning Center, which has been a longstanding and very important priority of the board, to expand the number of seats that we can accommodate in early childhood learning. And that's going to be harder now because we've had to take a lot of the money that we had built up to dedicate to that is no longer there. And so I'm very concerned about our long-term budget prospects because of the unknowns related to the economy that have nothing to do with this issue, but we just have to be very careful, I think.
Let me frame the question slightly differently, because I think we're conflating two things in this conversation. Let me ask it this way. Are you more comfortable with the number that looks like what has happened historically consistently over the last 15 years? Or are you more comfortable with the number that does not look like what has happened over the last 15 years, ignoring the pandemic? Do you want the number that's more mathematically normalized, or do you want the number that's not? And that's a fair way of asking it, because the other point that you're raising, where you're saying you're not sure about budget, you're not sure costs are going up, school funding is going down, or state funding is going down. There's a whole ton of pressures that are totally unenvisioned that has come up with the pandemic. But keep in mind fundamentally that we were set with a charter to identify a certain number that we were targeted to hit with this project. We were not targeted to try to find more money given the uncertainty of what might be coming up. And so if what we're saying is we maybe want to revisit some of those initial assumptions and take even more money out of the senior exemption just because we're not sure what's going to happen, that's a very different conversation than can you hit this particular number given these kind of underlying core assumptions. And so I would throw the question back at you. Do you want the number that looks like it's looked like historically, or do you want the more conservative number, which is fundamentally taking more money from the senior exemption in order to hit some of the budget uncertainties that are coming up?
Hans, just for the benefit of the board, I'm not sure I would simplify it quite that much. I get the point of what you're saying, but I think we're also in a very uncertain time. And I don't think it's as simple as saying this is what the trends looked like over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and assuming they'll continue to look the same as though it's just a mathematical, do you believe the math or not? I think it's a little more complex than that, but I understand what you're saying about don't use this as the lever. If the concern is something different, but I also don't want board members thinking, I don't personally think it's that simplistic of saying it's this or it's that.
Yep. I mean, the reality is the pandemic
three reasons.
Go ahead, James, sorry.
Even absent the pandemic, the growth rate in enrollment had already plateaued out. And we had seen that, we had discussed that when we had talked about the 1.2 million and sort of planning for that in our system. We had already seen some discussion of real estate and that sort of stuff. And the number you're talking about when you say conservative, Georgia State gave us two numbers, the 7 or the more conservative 4. I would definitely
inverse.
Right.
7 is more conservative than the 4.
Gotcha. I think it would be fiscally irresponsible. And remember, this hasn't been mentioned. Let's put it out there. We want it to be revisited in 5 years. That's incredibly important. But given that within the next 5 years, we're dealing with COVID and real estate and a whole upheaval of stuff and a plateauing of numbers, I think that's the fiscally responsible things to do for the kids of the city of Decatur.
So let me, again, mathematically speaking, the two things that you just said, the plateauing of the values of the homes in the digest and the plateauing of the number of students enrolling, both argue for the lower growth rate, not the 7% growth rate, right? So let's be, I would just want to be mathematically clear what we're talking about.
That's not necessarily true, because when the numbers go down, we get less funding. So actually, because kids didn't show up for kindergarten this year, we potentially will lose a tremendous amount of funding. So and that's separate
also
from the plateauing. So it's in addition to, so, I mean, for us, it's actually like it can be beneficial for enrollment to continue to steadily grow, because then we know that our funding will increase.
Let me ask it this way, and to look for a sign from the board members. If I've heard Heather and James and I think I share the view that there's risk either way, and we just feel the need to be conservative given uncertainties ahead. If that is a consensus view, then perhaps we should move on and just assume that that's what we're going to work with. I'm happy to discuss it further. I'm asking whether we should or need to. Seeing a nod from Jana. Am I misreading you, Jana?
No, that's fine with me.
Okay. Tasha?
Yeah, I think I was more interested in kind of seeing a few more numbers from GSU as far as the impact that either of those numbers would have. And I get the explanation, Hans, that you're saying. And I think when we started off with the conservative versus the conservative versus the more risky, then we've that's how we're looking at it now. And there is nothing that has the word risk in it that feels comfortable. Right. And so I would rather look at what the 4% and the 7% could potentially do and look at it that way instead of putting those two labels on those numbers, because otherwise, we're going to lean toward being more conservative, because that's just with COVID and all the craziness that feels better to say. But I don't know, without having kind of a little bit more of those numbers, if that really is what we'll be doing.
So the straight mathematics are, if we go with the 4%, it means that homes that are $120,000 higher in value would get exemptions. If we go with the 7% number, then we're reducing the home value by $120,000 before they would qualify for those exemptions. And so that's kind of the core, right? Point well taken regarding what has happened historically does not necessarily hold true going forward, Dr. Duty. Yeah, that's totally true, right? God only knows. If we are, so I think it's kind of straightforward from this conversation that my perspective is use the number that looks more like what reality has been up to this point, but comfortable if that's not the case. What we need to do, if we are looking at the 7% growth rate, is I think there's been strong consensus around the table that the $90,000 income that went along with that is too high. And so I would suggest, if we're going to use the 7% growth rate, then we need to look at the 7% growth rate with a $65,000 income and see what that does to home value. It'll increase it somewhat. It's not going to increase it a ton, but instead of 160, it might be 170,000. I don't know. We'll have to see where those numbers come out.
My question is, do we have to make the decision about the growth rate tonight, or can we wait till we get the additional information like that Tasha was referencing to see how those different numbers would impact?
We certainly don't have to make it tonight. I think that we need to find a way so that when we come to the November board meeting, we have put a specific proposal on the table with numbers, and we're not and this is fine, this discussion we're having, but we need to find a way as a board to come up with, and of course we don't vote until then, but we need to know what we're putting forward. And so and we have to figure that out.
Could I ask for clarification on exactly what those numbers are? Because between the 4 and the 7%, we actually have, I think we have all the numbers in front of us that we need for that. So I just, if we don't feel like we have those numbers, I want to make sure that we really truly understand what numbers we're missing.
I understood, Tasha. I should just ask Tasha. I thought that Tasha was asking about the number of families or
Oh.
seniors affected by
Gotcha.
either scenario.
Gotcha. Loud and clear. Yep.
Correct. Mhm.
Yep.
And now,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'll tell you my perspective for what it's worth, Tasha, is that I feel like we need to make this decision based on our budgetary priorities and comfort with risk, rather than necessarily changing the dial on our budget assumptions in order to reach more people. In the same way that when we began this process, we said we're comfortable with the $1.2 million annual budget impact. We're going to live within that and structure an exemption that reaches as many people and achieves as many of the goals as we want. I kind of feel like in terms of fiscal responsibility, this is sort of the same thing, that we should make a decision on our risk tolerance here. And I kind of feel like that should be based on our risk tolerance rather than necessarily changing and accepting more risk in order to provide a greater benefit. That's my perspective, but I'm happy to hold this discussion open and kind of look at the numbers and see where it comes out. So,
Hans, based on your experience with the numbers so far, do you think it's even worth, I hear all of you and I'm trying to think in the middle in here. Is it even worth going back and looking at a 6% growth and to see where does that land? Or are we just now tweaking way too many parts of the model?
So the growth rate by far is the biggest impactor, right? I mean, you see that in like it's the difference between 160 and 220,000. Well, I should say second to millage. If you guys want to grow the millage going in out years, then this is all off the table. But assuming the millage stays flat, things that are percentages in out years, like growth rates, those have the largest impact. And so the difference between a 4%, 5%, 6%, and 7%, it's $20,000 of home value each increment that you move along, right? Roughly, like it's actually non-linear and whatever. It gets to be a pain in the butt. But the fact is that it will impact it quite a bit. If you say, 5% instead of 7% or 6% instead of 7%, you are going to get higher home values. It is probably a mistake of mine to have framed it in terms of conservative and not conservative. The reality is it's hyper conservative, normal, and we probably should have a much lower number, like 3% or 2%, that is aggressive. To get a sense of what the range of things look like. I don't necessarily know that we need to go back to Georgia State and do a 2% because you guys aren't going to take it. Like, that's pretty safe to say. But, just so that we're clear, your growth rate in exemption cost over the last couple of years has been in the 4% range, full stop. And so it is the way that it's looked. And there's no question moving 3 points higher to 7%. In my mathematical opinion, what you are selecting to do in that scenario is reduce down the 1.2. It means you're basically saying, really, we want more like 800 or 900,000, not the 1.2. Okay. Because I think the 7% is past conservative. It's aggressive. It's a little bit of a clawback.
I have a suggestion.
Say that again.
I have a suggestion. James is pointing. Does that mean that you'd like to?
I'd like to hear the suggestion.
My suggestion, and this is that, I don't think we have enough information to make a final decision on this, one way or the other. It seems clear to me that we're going to need to meet one more time prior to the November meeting. And so I would suggest that we adjourn, but with a plan that we find a time on our calendars when we can meet again. I'd suggest that we set that up to try to be a relatively brief work session, and that one we wouldn't necessarily expect to take public comment. Instead, it would be more of a working session where we can just sort of nail this down, maybe spend an hour to an hour and a half. But at least, we can talk a little bit about calendar, but in enough time that we can put some materials out in front of people so that they have a meaningful opportunity to comment on a specific proposal prior to the meeting. So the real question is if you guys can tolerate one more of these Zoom calls.
I think I agree. We need to meet, since we don't have a concrete proposal right now, we have to meet again because we do need one at our November 10th, I believe it is, meeting. But my question is, are we going to need more data analysis run before then? And if so, I think we kind of need to know what that is going to be tonight, because otherwise I don't see how GSU can get us information by the interim meeting, which would need to be next week.
I don't see it either. So
Straight up, we need to run a $65,000 a year income on a 7% growth rate. Like that out of the gate, we need to know what home value we can exempt at that point, right? Because I think, and that's assuming that we're all sort of aligning around roughly a $65,000 income level, right? We do have to nail down one of these numbers in order to rerun the analysis. Yeah. If income is the one that we're closest to being comfortable with, we ought to set it because it also more or less has the smallest impact in terms of the number of people impacted and the overall set of numbers. If we're comfortable saying 65K is the income limit, rerun it to see what kind of home value we can get on a 7%. And I don't know, I'm going to split the difference and say 5.5%. I do feel like we should see something that's not just the most. Let me say it this way. There is no way for the cost of the exemption to be higher than the growth rate of the digest. It cannot be. That mathematically, it's not able to be. So when you're saying that the growth rate of the exemption equals the growth rate of the digest, that means no one in the entire rubric of people that are getting this benefit ever grow their home outside of the range of the value of the benefit, nor does any of their income grow above the range of the benefit that we provide. Like it's not, that is the uberest outside scenario. It's just not going to happen. It absolutely is going to be less than the growth rate of the digest. The question is then really, do you trust the 7%? If you think the digest is going to grow faster than 7%, then maybe 7% is a good number. But I would say let's try to lock it on around the 65, and we can rerun the analysis with this range and at least see what that does for home value.
And board members, I know that you've had a lot put on you tonight. So if you'd rather sleep on it, and I can call you all tomorrow and try to feel where you are, and then Hans and I can follow up with GSU, that's an option as well. I just know it's a lot to digest, some very complicated stuff here. So
that seems like a good suggestion to me.
Okay. That's a good suggestion, David.
So does that leave open? I missed a little bit of that. My thing here ran out of juice, but
well, let's at least define the questions. So I think Hans has done a good job so far, and let's make sure that's all. So we need to agree on what percentages we want to see the growth rate run at, whether it's 4, 5, 6, 7, 5.5, whatever those are. So we need to agree on what scenarios need to be run there. And then we need to agree on the dollar amount of the federal AGI. So those 2 points. Are there any other points?
We need to get the numbers of individuals impacted by the analysis. I mean, they know that, but we need to make sure that we reiterate it. We also need to see in whatever write-up they put forward in front of us, a clear elucidation of what the assumptions are, including, extremely importantly, this is presuming the stacking of other exemptions that folks are able to get. And then fundamentally what they are solving for based on the growth rates and the income that we give, what exemption value against the house can we get to?
Heather, how did you say the AGI question? I'm sorry, do you mind?
I just said we need to agree on the dollar limit of the federal AGI.
Yeah,
so the max cap.
I'm interested if anyone knows that average AGI for that age group indicator. I mean, I took the time to figure out federally it drops way down once you're retired. It's closer to 40,000.
This should be readily just knowable, should it not be? I mean, we don't know it on the call, but we should be able to find it out quickly, right?
Right. I mean, your RMD is, if you're retired, is much lower. You're, you know, if we're trying to get people who are on a fixed income, 65 is huge. You know, if
yeah,
I don't want to just assert things. I'm happy to always, but I don't want to.
But my question, can I would assume that we can like make a call to ARC and ARC would have the data for us. Or am I mistaken about that?
I feel like we ought to be able to find it on the census.gov or something. Like I do feel like, don't they do regional analyses like this? Paula, you unmuted. Sorry, you were going to say something.
I'm not sure that we're going to get it for Decatur specific. I know we can get it for the metro, but I'm not sure that we can get it Decatur specific by age group.
Okay.
The task force actually tried to get to that through ARC when we were doing the task force work. So.
Okay. And they just didn't have the numbers. They just didn't have it broken down that way. I see.
Well, then that's fine.
So, Heather, were you suggesting that we're not going to make a decision. We've discussed this on the percent growth rate. We need to know what we want, apparently, to ask GSU to do.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I don't even know enough to know that. I mean, but I'd be comfortable having you guys figure out, you know, we've got the two polls and then pick some in the middle and, you know, figure that out. Just give us a range would be fine with me. Unless somebody wants to name some interim values between 4 and 7. I mean, do we just want to have them give us one in the middle, or?
I guess, I mean, it's either 4, 5, 6, 7 or 4, 5.5, and 7. Probably. I mean, I guess we could go increments of 1 or increments of a half. I mean, I don't.
Why don't we do, so you've got the 4 and the 7.
Yeah.
They can rerun that at a different income. Let's just split the middle and do 5.5, right? Like that's going to at least directionally give us a sense of whether we're comfortable. I don't think the difference between 4 and 5 or 5 and 6 warrants the extra work.
All right, so 5.5. We'll get an extra data point there at 5.5, and then do we want to pick the income limit now, or do we want to hold that also for future thought? Based on after we get the information, for instance, if we at least ask the question and learn that we can't get the Decatur specific numbers.
I'd like to wait and get a little more data.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
All right. So let's talk about how are we gonna get, what do we need to, what data do we need to, like, what calls do we need to make tomorrow to try to get the data that we need? I'll call the folks at ARC and see if they can. I mean, I understand, Paul, that you have done it once, but I'll ask the question one more time and see if we can get that for Decatur. Is there any other piece of information that we need to try to collect?
We talked about number of households. Is that still something within reach?
I think
the two segments.
That was my understanding, is that we need to give kind of the parameters we're talking about, and then we're asking GSU to produce the information about the number of households affected. That's my understanding.
Correct. And just a quick word on that, just so that we're all on the same page. Because they've had to model income, it will be a modeled number of people impacted. So it's not like they could just do a column count in Excel. They've got to actually do a stochastic model, and it'll have some error bands, but it should be fairly tight. It just won't be, you know, a precise number of households.
I'd also like to point out that even if we can get an average household income for even any block of our seniors. We have far, far more seniors who are renters in the city of Decatur than are homeowners in the city of Decatur. That number is very lopsided, given all the senior, especially all the, I'm losing the word, sorry, it's late. The assisted, financially assisted buildings that we have a lot of those in Decatur. So even if we can get to those numbers, it's not gonna necessarily reflect our homeowners. It's just gonna reflect seniors.
Yeah, that's.
So yeah, I guess so we're saying that at what income limits do we want to run these scenarios? I think we're agreeing that we would do the 65, and then we're saying maybe additional income limits.
And maybe I'm wondering if the way to think about it, I'm trying to minimize the number of times that we have to convene or make calls. If we can get the Decatur specific, is it AMI? Do we want to say 100%? Let's figure out what that is. And if we can find it, then we'd run 80% and 100% of that number of X, of AMI, Decatur AMI.
For a 2-person household? Or
for a 2-person household. Does that work?
I think it sounds reasonable.
I can likely reach out to Doug Faust tomorrow and get the Decatur specific numbers. He's going to be the most likely source that I can think of off the top of my head.
That'd be great, please. Thank you.
Good. Sure.
So in that case, we're asking GSU to run 2 more scenarios, basically an 80% AMI at 5.5% growth rate and a 100% AMI at a 5.5 growth rate. Oh, and actually the same thing for
that's right.
the 4 and 7. So actually, right. Yeah, 6 scenarios.
Well, I mean, it did sound like we could probably drop the 4 and the 6, right? It sounded, I got a pretty clear signal from the board that you guys weren't comfortable at 4. And if you're not, then let's not run that number. If maybe 5.5 at the AMI or 80% of AMI, the 7 at 80% AMI,
okay.
That I want to try to start bringing the variables down a little bit so that we're not in the same conversation next time.
Agreed.
If we can land on what we consider the proper 80% AMI, then we can run that for the 5.5 and run it for the 7 and see where that takes us.
Thanks. I think that's where I was trying to go. So thank you for helping me. I agree. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty, then I think we're being specific on what we need to ask and minimizing the variables so that we can hopefully get the information quickly.
How long are we going to give to find that 80% AMI number? Right? If we aren't able to find it.
I feel like we ought to, let's get it tomorrow. And if we don't at least have an idea about why we need to wait 2 more days to get it. It just seems like the number either exists or it doesn't. And if we make the calls tomorrow, we're either going to find out that we can get it, we wait 2 more days, or we're going to get it, but we can't just hold it open, I don't think.
Or we can actually estimate it because there's a step down percentage from 4-person, 3-person, 2-person, 1. So, and I just sent the email to Doug. If he usually gets back to me fairly quickly. If I don't have it by in the morning, we can just do a simple calculation. It's not that.
All right.
Sticky.
Yeah, and I also don't want to dismiss the lived experience of everyone sitting around this table. I mean, like we all sort of out of the gate said 90 is too high, 45 feels maybe a little low. Like we are going to bound it within, and I'm telling you, the difference between 55 and 70 isn't going to be that much. Like we're just not going to impact the numbers that much, and so we are already probably within $15,000 just in terms of the likely outcome based on the experience of this conversation. And so I do want to set that too. Like it's probably not worth us killing ourselves over the next week to try to find this number. We're already more or less within the range.
Okay. So we are going to rely on you Paula, and you're going to have an answer for us tomorrow, and we're all set. And if we don't have an answer tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do with what we've got so that we can get to GSU to request these changes. We still need to talk about the time or the schedule for the next meeting. Right now, I would suggest we hold off to find out what GSU tells us about a turnaround time, and maybe check your emails, and we'll do a doodle poll with the expectation that we're going to do it though just as soon as we can. Does that work for everybody?
Sounds good.
All right. Once again, I want to just say, thank all the members of this committee. It's just, I feel so good about where we are in terms of having a good, smart proposal that really achieves what we've hoped to achieve here. So thank you for that, because we couldn't come close without all the effort that you've put into it. And so with that, we'll reconvene next in a couple of weeks, and then there'll be another opportunity for public comment for people to weigh in on the proposal at the November board meeting. And until then, I think we'll adjourn, and everybody have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.